Hello, welcome to The World Today. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
And I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines. Russia says it will allow ships carrying food out of blockaded ports if sanctions are lifted.
The long-awaited final report by top UK civil servant Sue Gray detailing rule-breaking parties in and around Downing Street during the pandemic is published. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he takes full responsibility.
Plus, U.S. lawmakers call for action over shooting in Uvalde, Texas. The schools in the San Antonio area begin increasing security precautions.
Welcome again. Russia has called for the lifting of sanctions that were imposed over its invasion of Ukraine as part of a comprehensive approach aimed at averting a global food crisis. But the Kremlin's Deputy Foreign Minister Andriy Rudenko says Russia is ready to provide a humanitarian corridor that would allow ships to sail fruit out of Ukraine if sanctions were lifted and Kyiv demined nearby waters.
Yesterday, the European Union accused Russia of using food supplies as a weapon with global repercussions. Earlier, the UK's Ministry of Defence said food prices worldwide would keep going up while the impasse continued.
Meanwhile, on the ground, Russian troops are currently trying to encircle the twin cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Ukraine says the Russian invasion is in the most active phase as Russia tries to capture the eastern Donbas region. Sweden, Finland and Turkey are holding talks to try to overcome Turkey's objections to the pair joining NATO. President Vladimir Putin has issued an order to simplify the procedure of handing Russian citizenship to residents of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions in Ukraine's south.
Indeed, Zaporizhia is still under Ukrainian control, but many surrounding areas are under Russian occupation. Here's more of the situation in this report.
According to Russia's defense ministry, the port of Mariupol, the Ukrainian city which was taken by Russian forces after a 3-month siege, is operating normally. Earlier on Wednesday, a news agency cited Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Andriy Rudenko as saying Russia is ready to provide a humanitarian corridor for vessels carrying food to leave Ukraine in return for the lifting of some sanctions. Rudenko was quoted as saying by another news agency, RIA, that Russia is in touch with the United Nations on the issue. Ukraine's Black Sea ports have been blocked since Russia sent thousands of troops into Ukraine on February 24th, and more than 20 million tons of grain are stuck in silos in the country. Russia and Ukraine account for nearly a third of global wheat supplies, and the lack of significant grain exports from Ukraine ports is contributing to a growing global food crisis. As Russia intensified its attacks on cities in the Donbas, people remaining in the war-torn region are undecided on whether to evacuate to safer cities or not. On Slovyansk's central market, the remaining stall owners are as frightened as those who board the trains. Market vendor Alina says that her disability and her family obligations keep her from leaving. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his nightly address on Tuesday that the situation in Donbass was extremely difficult. Meanwhile, Germany says it will keep supporting Ukraine as long as they need it. The Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, speaking to reporters on the sidelines of the Council of the Baltic Sea States, warned against a movement of fatigue and said pressure on Russia needed to be kept up.
Obviously, the Russian president is not willing to stop bombing innocent civilians, and that is why we have to make sure that Ukraine can defend their territory, defend their citizens, and we keep supporting them as long as they need it. And therefore, we are doing everything that citizens of Ukraine can live in peace and security as every other European country. But what we in democracy have to guarantee that if this war will go on, and obviously, unfortunately, it will go on as long as we don't know, that we don't reach a moment of fatigue where everybody in Europe, in society is saying, well, now this has been months of war and maybe we can move to other topics, because we have to keep up the sanctions until this fundamental breach of fundamental law is not there anymore.
Meanwhile, European Central Bank Chief Christine Lagarde says Europe must flex its muscles during times of adversity in reference to Russia's war in Ukraine. Ms. Lagarde addressed an audience at the World Economic Forum in Davos on a panel that included the Taoiseach of Ireland, Dutch Prime Minister, and the President of the European Parliament.
Ukraine has been top on the agenda for the four-day meeting of global business leaders, which kicked off in earnest on Monday with a video addressed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The ECB chief says the war in Ukraine reveals Europe had underestimated its strength in numbers.
As often in Europe, united in diversity and rising in adversity. We are in that situation of adversity, and we need to flex our muscles. We do have collective incredible muscles. I'll give you a few areas where we actually do that a bit, and we can do more. In competition policies, yes, we do take action. Yes, we can actually affect companies that are doing things outside Europe, but will have an impact on the European territories. We can stop mergers that are taking place in other places if it is going to affect Europe. In trade, we represent a monumental market that can actually set terms and conditions in negotiations with others. In monetary policy, it so happens that those 19 countries, soon to be joined by 2 new members, you were asking about new members, Croatia, I cross fingers, should soon be joining the club, and Bulgaria is next online. So it will soon be 21 countries in one single club by one single currency standard. Well, this is the second international currency in the world. It doesn't have the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, but it is the second international currency of the world. And when monetary policy decisions are made in Frankfurt,
Now, Hungary's government will be announcing the first measures to respond more quickly to challenges created by the war in neighboring Ukraine. Hungary's re-elected president, Viktor Orban, who won a 4th consecutive term in an election on April 3rd, has used a special legal order in the past, once due to Europe's migration crisis and later during the COVID-19 pandemic. The new state of emergency similarly empowers Mr. Orban's government to approve measures by decree. In a Facebook video, he said, "The world is on the brink of an economic crisis," reiterating that Hungary must stay out of the war in Ukraine and protect families' financial security. Mr. Orban's government is having to deal with the consequences of the war in Ukraine, annual inflation of 9.5% and a budget deficit that ballooned in the first quarter due to a pre-election spending spree. It also needs to avoid a marked slowdown in the economy.
Let's come to Ukraine's economy now. When Ukrainians aren't talking about war, there's a fair chance that they are talking about petrol. For the past 3 weeks, the country has found itself in the midst of an acute fuel shortage, which means that all but a handful of pumps nationwide are closed to the public.
Well, since the war started, actually. Last week, the 550-kilometer road from Lviv to Kyiv had just 2 working petrol stations. Each had a queue tailing back several hundred meters. A station on the approach to the capital was also remarkable in being closed, but attended by more than 50 vehicles. A rumor had circulated that deliveries might be arriving in a few hours. Well, joining us now for more on this is economist Dr. Biodun Adedigbe. Dr. Adedigbe, thank you for joining us on the program this evening.
Yeah, and thank you so very much for having me.
Indeed, and I'm glad we can hear you. First of all, it seems the war has made life, well, it doesn't seem, it has made life impossible for Ukraine's energy planners. It's damaged critical infrastructure, it's broken many supply chains. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you so very much. Now, when this war started, I thought about the whole issue and came up with 5 critical questions about the war. The first question I asked is, where is the war taking place? Obviously, inside Ukraine territory. Second question is, what are those things or people that are suffering? And of course, it talks to lives being lost, of course, disruptions, and not only that, assets being destroyed. And we come to the third question of infrastructure being destroyed, as you said, everything happening within Ukraine. Then the next question I ask myself is, who are the beneficiaries of this war? Now, anywhere in the world that a war is being fought, the primary beneficiaries usually are in the defense industry, that is those who produce weapons. So either in terms of fresh supplies or the replacement of what is being used to prosecute the war, which means the economics of it is that primarily the beneficiaries are in those countries or locations where the weapons being used have been produced. And of course, ultimately, we now say, okay, let's look at it globally, how it affects the rest of us. So in my own estimation, by all means, it has caused disruptions to life within Ukraine and also the rest of the world. And so we are looking at the consequences, now compounding the challenges we faced with COVID-19 that we're just pulling out of in 2021. Yes, now the reality that we thought would begin to happen this year and next year is staring us in the face. Inflationary pressures all around the world, and then the growth that every economy achieved in 2021 as a result of the stimulus in response to COVID-19 impact on the economies. Now, we expect the economies to slow down. Once they begin to slow down, and the inflationary pressures we are seeing now compounded by that war will lead us seeing most countries tumbling into stagflation to start with. That means stagnancy in terms of growth of the economy, and then you have inflationary pressures. Of course, you begin to see recessions and contractions of economic activities.
Well, so the problem really is that we're not on the ground in Ukraine to really know, the impact of, this war on the economy. But before the war began on February 24th, 80% of the country's fuel was being imported. Many of that came by rail from Belarus, which is now an enemy to Ukraine, and also participants in this war. A small part of that came by sea into Black Sea ports, which are now closed by the Russian naval blockade. What choices does Ukraine have now?
I will put that in this context. First is that you produce and supply locally only 20% of your refined petroleum products consumption. That means, in any way, you have to begin to ration. And rationing, of course, in economic terms means you want to set your priorities and then ask yourself, where should most of what you have available go to? Based on information available, that is already happening in Ukraine. And the primary consideration for refined petroleum products allocation is to the military. That one is already given in terms of information available there. Then, of course, the response to the rest of it will be to identify essentials, and that means essential economic activities will also need to be set out and apart to receive also some percentage of that 20% space that they have remaining from local production. Then secondly, will be for those who need to move, they probably should now be thinking of giving priority as well to mass transit where necessary. And then ultimately, to also appeal to people to avoid fossil fuel-powered means of transportation, so that will also reduce the pressure in the domestic oil market. Those are the 3 things I believe they can do in the light of what we have seen them do so far, which is rationing and putting more attention to allocations to the military.
Would you also make such suggestions, especially for people who are in other parts of Ukraine? Because, you know, we've seen Russian rockets destroying a dozen fuel storage facilities, railways restricting even agriculture. And we know that there are persons who are living in other parts of Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah, that's really a major challenge. But in a war situation, the first thing we say is safety first. And that means even if you are able to continue to live your normal lifestyle, so to say, which means you are able still to engage in your normal economic activities, whether in agriculture or other spaces within the economy, it will still be with the underlying tension and fear that the war can escalate and get where you are. So everything you want to do will be with caution. So in that case, if you look around today, most commodity prices in such an environment will be driven not by today's rate of inflation, what you call the current inflation rate, but it will be driven mostly by expected inflation, which means it is not out of place to expect, in fact, based on what is observed currently, that prices are ticking up, which is normal in a situation like this where supply is hampered. So certainly prices are going up, but unfortunately, the strange thing that we're now crawling is expected inflation that will make those having supplies available begin to sell higher than they would ordinarily have done if the country weren't in a war situation, even in the areas where life is still having the semblance of normality.
Even in the war. And also, Dr. Adedikpe, we saw last night the EU announced, you know, allowing for temporary trade liberalization, other trade concessions with regard to certain Ukrainian products. This means that for 1 year, import duties on all exports, Ukrainian exports to the EU will not be due. How far does this go to help the country?
Yeah, I will say that is a very good gesture. But when it comes to international trade, which is the key issue here, the first thing you have to do is to produce. And when you produce, after that kicks in logistics, you know, what we describe as the issues involved in supply chains, especially from where it's produced locally to the point of dispatch to the global market, and then from there to get it to the global market. So it means what you produce must walk through the supply chains and then get a passage to become export. So in which case, until it leaves Ukraine for the target market globally, it doesn't become an export. It still remains what is locally produced. So the real big issue I see here is logistics. And that means the benefits of this gesture from the European Union will only become fully expropriated by Ukraine when the disruptions to supply chains and logistics are resolved. And I don't see that coming to, you know, a major benefit until the war is over.
Economist Dr. Biodun Adedikpe, BA Consult, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us on the program.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Coming up on The World Today. 19 children and 2 teachers are killed in a school shooting in Texas. President Joe Biden makes an emotional call for the U.S. to stand up to the gun lobby and tighten restrictions. We'll have more on this. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the program. We go over to Yemen, which is searching for new wheat suppliers, but says it will need to pay for increasingly costly imports. This comes as the World Food Programme warns of cuts to food aid for millions already living on the brink of famine. Disruptions in global wheat supplies due to the Ukraine war and India's sudden ban on wheat exports risk deepening Yemen's hunger crisis and exacerbate food price inflation, which has doubled in neighboring parts of the country in just 2 years. The WFP's country director in Yemen says the number of people in the country living in near famine conditions could rise to 7 million in the second half of 2022 from around 5 million now.
Because we're all lining up in India now, and Yemen will eventually go at the end of the queue. And so what we're saying is if no mechanisms is put in place to help position the Yemeni private sector to continue its position, we're afraid that other, I would say, countries will take I wouldn't say share, but will just push us in the back of the queue, and which will have obviously an impact on our access to the global commodity markets. So when we look at the port data, we might see in the port data that shipments and supplies are still entering into Yemen, the report data from March or even April, right? And people might see this at face value that, shipments are coming in, things are quite secure. The reality is that these shipments that reached in March and April are shipments and contracts that have been locked months before that. So the actually shock, we will start seeing the shock in the coming months.
Well, more membership bids are coming up in Europe, this time to the European Union, as the Prime Ministers of Moldova and Georgia press on with their bids to join the European Union, citing a historic moment for accession. This they did at the panel discussing the expansion of the EU in Davos. Georgian Prime Minister Irkali Garishvili says his country will do whatever it can to achieve full membership of the EU and calls for action now. Moldova has pressed ahead with the efforts to join the European Union amid fears it could be drawn into the conflict in Ukraine. Prime Minister Natalia Gavrilita says her country must not lose this historic opportunity to join the EU, and any projects to bring the country closer to the bloc must not replace the route to full membership. Moldova signed a formal application to join the EU in March as war with Ukraine was on its doorstep. Georgia, on the other hand, had fought a war against Russia in 2008. It also applied for membership in March. Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova are 3 of the 6 countries the EU classifies as neighbors under its Eastern Partnership Initiative.
And in a report released at the annual World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, chief economists have pointed to the potentially devastating consequences of the fragmentation of the global economy, with lower economic activity, higher inflation, lower real wages and greater food insecurity likely to bring severe global impact.
That's right. The report estimates that several countries worldwide will suffer inflation, with the worst projections for the US, followed by Europe and Latin America. With wheat prices forecast to increase by more than 40%, it forecasts the world will also face severe food insecurity, especially in the Middle East and in North Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. Managing Director of the World Economic Forum says many companies are having to overcome the challenges posed by the lingering impacts of COVID-19, as well as the spillover effects of the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Well, to look at the implication of this around the world, joining us from Abuja studio is Dr. Tokpet Fasua. He's an economist. Thank you for joining us. Good to see you. Let's begin. I mean, there appears to be so many factors driving this global report from Davos. Which one in particular will impact Sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, and what can we do to lift us out of it?
Right, thank you for inviting me. So we have quite a few factors, as you've noted. I mean, there's the global inflation going on, and of course, locally here, we also have our own multidimensional inflation, if you ask me. We're just basically absolutely just crawling out of the COVID pandemic, you know, and the lockdowns, never before seen type of lockdowns, you know, and then this, you know, and of course you have the Russian-Ukraine war, and of course the structural problems with our economy still remain. When you look at the structure of the Nigerian economy, trade, for example, import and export, you'd find some very shocking numbers there, because our main export, apart from crude oil and gas, our main exports is things like sesame seeds and oil seeds and sorghum and stuff like that. We get about $380 million from that every year. And then you have cocoa, we have about $280 million. But when you look at the imports, you find that apart from technological imports, which is actually the bulk of what we import every year, the phones, the laptops, the softwares, and so on, and of course the manufactured goods and the machines and what have you, you know, that we're talking about 35 billion or thereabout, you know, and of course we still are stuck with importing petrol and diesel and all of that. The next thing you'll see that we import about 2.7 billion this time around, dollars worth of grains. And so you begin to think about Ukraine and Russia, where we get about 40–45% of wheat from every year. We import still about 970 million. Now compare that to cocoa and the other seeds and all of that we export. 970 million worth of fish and crustaceans. Another 870 million worth of milk and dairy. So, you know, you take only one of those and they probably just eclipse the entire exports that we take out of Nigeria, given that our crude oil export is also countered by our import of petroleum. So, you know, I think that the reports and the projections coming from Davos is a little bit lenient on Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, we can't even be compared with an economy like Egypt anymore. Egypt gets quite a bit of, you know, dollars from tourism, and they've repositioned their medical sector, their construction sector, and they're growing at about 8%. And look at where we are. So, I mean, we're in a very bad situation. I think that if we are not being alarmed by the global inflation and, of course, the threats of a global recession coming out of Davos, we ought to be alarming ourselves.
You know, we've lost a chance for global economic recovery sustenance. We're seeing what our central bank did yesterday in terms of the interest rate.
Oh, yes. The central bank was constrained, or rather the Monetary Policy Committee, because since September 2020, almost 2 years, the rates have been left at 11.5. You begin to wonder if there's anything they could do, or if it's going to just remain that way forever. And of course, recently, inflation started ticking up back from the 15% level to 16.8 or thereabout, you know, meaning that that rings alarm bells. You know, is it going to continue? And so the MTC, under the central bank, was constrained to do something. I'm a little bit more radical in my economic thinking. I would have thought that rather than, you know, increasing interest rate, they ought to have reduced it, because in increasing interest rate to 13% from 11.5%, I mean, we're talking about the monetary policy rate, which the banks, the commercial banks, are supposed to take a cue from that. In doing that, you are going to damage the 3.11% growth that we have. And in fact, that growth moved down from quarter to quarter. We're seeing 3.11 down from about 3.82 or thereabout, you know, percent. And when you increase interest rate, what you're saying in effect is that borrowers, manufacturers, producers will have to borrow at a much higher cost. And of course, the lending rates in Nigerian banks today is anything from 25% to, in some instances, up to 35%. You know, so you're slowing down the economy. So I'm of the opinion that we oughtn't be slowing down our economy. However, the pressure on the central bank is not even only from local, you know, issues of inflation, but also is international from lenders and the multilateral organizations who have always insisted that we need to increase rates. I mean, increasing to a 16.8%. I mean, to the inflation at 16.8% and the rates at 13%. It's not looking good. If we look at Ghana just next door, you will see that even their consistent increase increase of their monetary policy rate up to about 19% now has not slowed down their inflation. They're still at 23%, about 23.6%. Now, what that means is that African countries, especially sub-Saharan African countries, need to stop reading the good old economic textbooks and think for themselves. If we don't think for ourselves, we're going to just keep rigmaroling and damaging our economy. Our inflation is multifaceted. Some of it is coming from the demand side because central banks have had to really intervene in economies as a result of COVID, and they're intervening more. Even this morning, I saw a report, the central bank said, look, we're going to even push out maybe about 1 trillion naira for some more interventions with farmers and so on. And now, not all of these interventions are backed by productivity because in the same vein, the central bank is also begging some of the farmers to please repay some of the monies they've borrowed because it's not supposed to be a national cake, you know. So because of that, if you're not matching what you're giving out back to back with productivity, enhance in society, growth in GDP, and all of that, if the farmers and whoever else is going to come back to you with stories and say, sorry, floods packed all the rice away, we can't do this, we can't do that, and you can't really force them. Therefore, you're going to be seeing such monies hitting the system directly in terms of money supply, chasing the same goods that are produced. I mean, if we're intervening, for example, with rice, but the price of rice is still rising very much, maybe up to 32,000, 35,000 as we speak. So we need to start thinking and actually proffering, you know, opinions and ideas that are outside the box. As a matter of fact, I was reading something on Reuters, and you know, they adduced that, look, Ghana is likely to shift interest rates up before Nigeria does that because Nigeria does heterodox policies. And I think that those heterodox policies are the ones that have actually helped us a little bit till date. And those heterodox policies are the ones that we perhaps need to think about some more. Because if we want to run it the way the economic textbook says, increase your interest rates so that inflation will slow down. Oftentimes, inflation doesn't go down. The people only suffer. Productivity reduces. GDP stops to grow. And we're supposed to be growing at a much higher rate than we are. You know, so I think that we need to, I hope they are brainstorming somewhere. And I think that the circles in which this brainstorming happens continues to increase to get more ideas from everywhere.
Yeah, and you have said a whole lot. I was going to jump in there and ask, you know, if the present, if the decision by the Central Bank of Nigeria does reflect the present realities that the world is currently going through. We're facing a global food shortage, and of course our economy will be challenged by what's going on with the war in Ukraine. Europe is already being affected. The rest of the world is also being affected. What the CBN is doing now in Nigeria, is it practical when you compare that with what else is happening?
Yes, you know, I mean, I would say it's practical, but what I've just said now, and which I probably would repeat, is that there's a need for the central bank. I mean, of course, there's a monetary policy unit of the economy. Perhaps a lot of people will allege that, hey, you guys are getting involved in fiscal policy now. However, what I've read so far in global economies, every time there's a downturn, the monetary policy unit of the economy seem to move into the fiscal policy because, hey, you can't just keep juggling interest rates and inflation when the economy is on fire. You have to do some more. You have to get out of your shell, out of your box, and do something extra. So yes, it is, but however, it's very, very important for the central bank to also follow the money and find every way to ensure that whatever it is they're giving out actually adds directly to the GDP by way of boosting production. And that's where the issue is. And of course, they know that they have problems getting some of those monies back as and when due. You know, that means that maybe someone has used the money to do all sorts of things and diverted funds and so on. It shouldn't be seen as national cake. You know, so it is trite. However, we also need to challenge ourselves more, both the central banks, the farmers, the Ministry of Agri, whoever else is a stakeholder here, that look, Nigeria is still cultivating about 30% of its arable land as it is. Nigeria is a very lucky country in terms of topography. And the north of this country is, I mean, like they say, the food basket. There's so much going on. a lot of what I told you, if cocoa comes from the south, if the cocoa comes from the southwest into some southeast states, into Cross River State, is a very big state in terms of cocoa. But the vast majority of our export goes from the north. The soya bean, the sorghum, the sesame seed, the fonio, in the crops in which we are doing very well, a lot of it comes from including yam from Benue State, from Kogi State, from some of those places, and a lot of them we don't even capture them because of bottlenecks within the country. We can't even export them through our ports. And again, we need to then begin to, of course, they end up exporting them through Ghana because it's easier to take things to Ghana from the north of Nigeria through the Ghana port. Our cassava and yam, our hibiscus gets exported through those places because, you send something from Kano to Lagos State for export, you need to give your truck driver maybe 500,000 naira.
We could go on and on with this, Dr. Fashola. Thank you so much for breaking it down for us and helping us understand this better. I appreciate your coming on the program today.
Cheers.
In the meantime, the United Kingdom says it's willing to channel some of the country's special drawing rights through the African Development Bank, but strong mechanisms need to be developed. Speaking at the AFDB's 57th annual meetings held in Accra, the Deputy Director of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, Vicky Ford, called on other advanced economies to support the move, as the UK is legally unable to do this by itself.
While recognising the work of the bank, she says due to the present legal challenges, she encourages the AFDB to continue to find other ways to secure funding. African leaders have called for the reallocation of the International Monetary Fund's SDRs to regional multilateral development banks, such as the AFDB, to better support countries in the region.
African presidents, finance ministers, central bank governors, policymakers and other participants gather in Accra's International Conference Center for the African Development Bank's 57th annual meetings.
With our board of governors,
in his opening remarks, the AFDB president, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, says Africa has no other choice but to adapt to climate change.
We will build a much stronger Africa, a climate-resilient Africa, an Africa with energy security for all. Africa has no choice but to adapt to climate change that it did not cause. To support the continent in doing so, the African Development Bank has doubled its financing for climate to $25 billion by 2025.
Also taken to the stage, Post-President Nana Akufo-Addo makes the case for the African Development Bank to handle the special drawing rights for the continent and for the bank to take a more prominent role.
The strategic decision to make the AFDB the delivery vehicle for these SDRs must be pursued and achieved. Leveraging the SDRs 4 times as AFDB does will significantly boost resources for Africa's transformation. We must activate a process that moves this bank from the corridors of billions to trillions, given the scale of the challenges on this continent.
Participating in a presidential dialogue on Africa's development challenges and opportunities, Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan also calls for special drawing rights to be allocated to multilateral development banks such as the AFDB.
We have to raise our voice, asking the multilateral financiers to allow FDB to access to SDRs, because those are going to benefit Africa. We'll be close to get funds from our own bank for our own development.
Over the next few days, discussions at the African Development Bank's annual meetings will also cover a range of other topics, including green jobs for youth and women, as well as building resilient rural economies for a food-secure and prosperous Africa. From Accra, Ghana, Teniola Shobowale for Channels Television News.
Still ahead on the program. Among the dazzling blooms on display at the annual Chelsea Flower Show this week is a pale pink rose that has been especially bred to mark Queen Elizabeth 70 years on the throne. We have that and more when we return.
Welcome back. And in the United States, a teenage gunman opened fire at an elementary school in South Texas on Tuesday, killing more than a dozen children and at least 2 teachers in the latest instance of gun violence sweeping the United States. Authorities say the suspect, identified as 18-year-old Salvador Ramos, acted alone and was apparently killed by police officers responding to the scene.
Governor Greg Abbott said 2 officers were struck by gunfire, but said their wounds were not serious. A visibly shaken President Joe Biden addressed the nation in the evening of the day, urging Americans to stand up to gun lobbyists and pressure members of Congress to pass sensible gun laws.
In the meantime, Texas Governor Greg Abbott is expected to hold a press conference later to give an update on the state's response to the Robb Elementary School shooting. Schools in the San Antonio area have been increasing security precautions in response. Several school districts said they would increase the police presence on campuses this week.
U.S. lawmakers have also been sharing their thoughts on the shooting, or as Speaker Nancy Pelosi described it, the cold-blooded massacre of little school children and teachers. Speaker Pelosi posted a thread of tweets in which she said the gunman had stolen the futures of children and condemned U.S. politicians who do little to enforce gun control. Here's more reactions in this report.
As a nation, we have to ask, when in God's name are we going to stand up to the gun lobby? When in God's name we do what we all know in our gut needs to be done?
A visibly shaken President Joe Biden addressing the nation in the aftermath of the Texas school shooting, urging Americans to stand up to gun lobbyists and pressure members of Congress to pass sensible gun laws.
The idea that an 18-year-old kid can walk into a gun store and buy 2 assault weapons is just wrong. What in God's name do you need an assault weapon for except to kill someone?
Enough is the warning from Vice President Kamala Harris, calling for courage to take action.
So, I think we all know and have said many times with each other, enough is enough. Enough is enough. As a nation, we have to have the courage to take action and understand the nexus between what makes for reasonable and sensible public policy to ensure something like this never happens again.
Nel nome del Padre, del Figlio e dello Spirito Santo.
It is a heartbreaking situation for Pope Francis, who says he's heartbroken by the shooting that killed at least 19 children and 2 teachers, calling for greater controls on weapons in the U.S. A statement released by the United Nations says the Secretary General is deeply shocked and saddened by the mass shooting, saying that it is particularly heart-wrenching that most of the victims are children. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky also offers his condolences to the relatives of the victims, calling it an awful shooting in an elementary school. The Chinese Foreign Ministry also expressed deep sorrow for the victims and sympathy and condolences to their families, adding that the shooting once again bears the United States human rights deficit. Over in India, students in the northern Amritsar city held a candlelight vigil at school in remembrance of the 19 children and the 2 teachers killed by the teenage gunman. Sandeep Sareen, principal of the Sareen Infotech Senior Secondary School, describes the latest mass shooting as heart-wrenching. Families remain absolutely devastated by this latest school shooting, a situation that America is depressingly familiar with. Relatives of victims are in heavy grief as the identities of pupils and teachers killed at the Robb Elementary School become known. The elementary school now joins a list of school shootings that has brought about the death of innocent school children. There have already been 27 school shootings this year alone. Young school children routinely rehearse what to do if a gunman enters their classroom. Active shooter lockdown drills are now a common part of the school curriculum from primary to high school.
Joining us now is our correspondent in Washington, Maria Bird. Maria, thanks for joining us. And this is just a really sad and horrific event in the United States, but not one that we haven't seen before. It's become a recurring one in the U.S. And incidentally, the country is the only one in the Western Hemisphere where these mass shootings have become rampant. Why is that? And why is it so difficult to pass those gun laws? Maria, you need to unmute your mic.
Sorry, can you all hear me?
Yes.
This is one that is reminding us of Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook was the young children more, unfortunately, than what we're seeing here in Texas. But when you're talking about 19 children, 2 adults, and you're talking about the grief that is among those communities. Americans are stricken today. People are concerned to send their children to school today, just afraid of what might happen. And so this has been an extremely tough day. It's tough 24 hours for Americans across the board.
Maria, just thinking about how this teenager got access to the guns, I know the owner of the store or the person who sold the semi-automatic rifles to him must have done a background check. But do people ever stop to think what a teenager could be doing with such a weapon?
Well, this weapon was not one that just a gun that you purchase for safety and security of your home. This gun was one that is like a military use. Some of the children are even identifiable from the standpoint of they're having to use DNA to be able to identify a child. And so that just tells you that the weaponry that was used was beyond reproach. It was beyond what anybody could even imagine. And to think that this individual who, 18 years old, who actually secured this weapon on their 18th birthday, it just tells us that as a country, there's a lot that needs to be addressed from, as you said, the gun laws. And as people are asking, they're requesting on the president to put an executive order in place to address this issue, because it's beyond just mental health. There are laws that have to be put in place. And we know that Texas is one that's looking to even loosen those gun laws to be able to have open, unconcealed weapons. So this is a time that in American history where people are calling on the government, the congressional members, to take a stand for the safety and the lives of all Americans, especially the young.
Maria Bird, thank you, our correspondent there from Washington, as we continue to follow the story generating reactions around the globe.
Well, back home, Nigeria and Ethiopia have concluded arrangements to hold a joint ministerial commission meeting in Addis Ababa next month to discuss various areas of bilateral relations and exchange perspectives on a range of international issues of mutual interest. Agreement was reached when President Muhammadu Buhari hosted the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, to a state visit today.
It formed part of bilateral talks between the two leaders, which was held behind closed doors. A major outcome of the visit is a desire of both countries to take concrete steps to expand bilateral relations in key areas, including the economy, trade, science and technology, solid minerals, among others.
Well, speaking of Prime Ministers, today was Prime Minister's questions in the UK Parliament, and a humbled Boris Johnson says he takes full responsibility after a damning official report detailed a series of illegal alcohol-fueled parties at the British Prime Minister's Downing Street office during the coronavirus lockdowns. Mr. Johnson has faced repeated calls to resign from opposition politicians, as well as his own party, after it was revealed that both he and other government officials had broken the rules that meant people could not socialise outside their households or even, in many cases, attend funerals for loved ones. The report by senior official Sue Gray did not specifically blame Mr. Johnson, but it gave graphic details and included photographs from more than a dozen gatherings, some of which he attended. Opposition Labour leader Keir Starmer says the report will stand as a monument to the hubris and arrogance of Johnson's government.
Elections have unfolded, and frankly, Mr. Speaker, I have been appalled by some of the behaviour, particularly in the...
It's been a while I heard the word hubris. Well, among the dazzling blooms on display at the annual Chelsea Flower Show this week is a pale pink rose that has been especially bred to mark Queen Elizabeth's 70 years on the throne. Britain's David Austin roses sought royal approval for the Elizabeth, created to mark the monarch's platinum jubilee.
Queen Elizabeth visited the Chelsea Flower Show on Monday, the latest of several appearances that have helped to ease public concerns about her health ahead of the national celebration of her 7 decades on the throne. The 96-year-old monarch was driven around the Royal Horticultural Society's annual Festival of Gardens Design in West London in a buggy, saving her from having to walk around the show's attractions.
Gosh, she looks pretty in pink. The Chelsea Flower Show opened onto the public yesterday, and it will be running until Saturday, May 28th.
Interestingly, my birthday.
Oh, really?
Oh, God, did I just announce that to the whole world? Thanks for watching The World Today. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
I'm Melissa Walker.